problem. Nobody said life was perfect and easy. Everything is about trade-offs. Whether your trade-offs are how much you work, what field you go into, what you're majoring in college. I prefer that individuals make those trade-offs. We decide whether to be on Twitter, we decide whether to be on Facebook, we decide what search engine to use. I don't want politicians and bureaucrats getting involved because I just can't imagine that we would end up with a better system. And by all means, if we have more Wikipedia type things out there, that's great and that's wonderful. Because that's something that organically, spontaneously arose, not because some politician in Washington, decided to wave their magic wand and say this is how it should be. I much prefer the decentralized decisions of millions of people to decide these things, rather than a handful of people in Washington who I think are very easy to corrupt.
So I have a follow-up question to you, Dr. Mitchell, which is that Mr. Robinson hinted at something which is Facebook and many other digital tech companies are very undemocratic institutions, and I think that logic could be applied to other sectors too. So do you think that capitalist companies generally have a democracy problem? And would you be okay with any sort of proposal or program that would open up power and decision-making to wider people, such as companies opening up decision-making to workers in their factories?
Companies are not democratic, but they shouldn't be. And I guess maybe to start the answer to this question, our entire system was designed to be anti-democratic. The Constitution of the United States is a fundamentally anti-majoritarian document. Our rights enshrined in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights are anti-democratic. It doesn't matter if 90% of the country wants to restrict your free speech. Assuming the Supreme Court is doing its job, your right to free speech is protected no matter what the majority says. Our founding fathers had an attitude which I think is very good. They viewed untrammeled majoritarianism, pure democracy, as two wolves in a sheep voting what to have for lunch. Hitler was elected by a democratic process. Democracy by itself does not give good results. It's simply a way of having elections. Our Constitution said, no matter what the elections say, there are certain core rights that individuals have that are protected from the tyranny of the majority. I think that is very, very admirable. I love that part of our system. I don't want a system where, whether it's 55% of crazy Trump voters or 55% of crazy Bernie Sanders voters, I don't want a system where a majority can oppress a minority. Where do you think Jim Crow laws came in the South from? They came from a majority of the white voters. Of course, it was easy because they didn't even let the blacks vote, but they were democratically imposed. And the Supreme Court failed in its job to protect individual rights. So I don't necessarily view democracy as an end in and of itself. Yes, it's obviously a better system than anything else, but the powers of government, the rights of the individuals, in many cases should not be controlled by just majoritarian impulses. So now, having gotten that out of the way, in terms of corporate governance, when people say, impose democratic norms and things like that, right now corporations are answerable, assuming they're not cronyist and they're in bed with government, corporations answer to their consumers. And who else do they answer to? They answer to their owners, the shareholders. What do the shareholders want? They want to make profits. But how do you make profits in a genuine free market? Only by serving the interests and needs of consumers. I want that kind of dynamic, vibrant economy where there's lots of churning, where there's lots of competition, where the old dinosaur companies are allowed to die out. Here's an example that I was just talking up on Capitol Hill about. I was trying to explain free trade to a politician who thought he was free market but didn't understand it. I said, creative destruction is a terrible thing. Imagine you were in the candle making industry when the electric light bulb was invented. You probably lost your job. Imagine if you were in the typewriter industry when the personal computer came along. You lost your job. A dynamic, vibrant capitalist economy with creative destruction causes lots of damage all the time. But you know what? The reason we are so rich today is because of that process. The children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the candle makers are much richer today, even though one of their ancestors lost a job way back when. I want private companies guided by the profit motive, but not in bed with government. I want them to serve the interest of consumers. That's what I think capitalism is supposed to be about. That's what capitalism is about. I just want to make sure that it isn't corrupted by government getting too much power, because as I said before, when government gets more power, then the rich people and the corporations tend to see government as a shortcut for getting money as opposed to earning money in the marketplace.
So I think you've heard something just now that to me is quite disturbing, because I feel I am to my core a believer in democracy. Now, democracy is not a simple majority vote. It doesn't mean that if we all get to tyrannize over the minority. In fact, you see that on Wikipedia, right? Because it's a consensus process, so we all work together to try and resolve disputes, not just impose our will. But I think the statements that you've just heard about how democracy is bad because you can't let people have what they want. You can't, the Constitution has to restrict people. Now, if we think about what Dr. Mitchell has just defended, if we think about how the Founding Fathers wrote in restrictions on democracy, that's absolutely true. And it was very disturbing. Founding Fathers excluded people because they didn't trust them. They excluded, as you mentioned, black people, women. The Senate, if you are a person, if you're an African American or Hispanic person, you get far less representation in the United States Senate. If you are a Puerto Rican, you don't get represented at all in the United States Senate. If you are in Washington, D.C., you don't get represented at all. It is an anti-democratic system. The difference between myself and Dr. Mitchell is that I'm deeply disturbed when the majority of people want something like universal health care, and they don't get it because we have an anti-democratic system. The Founding Fathers were pretty open about the fact that they wanted to protect what they called the minority of the opulent, the rich people. They wanted to protect their own privileges, the privileges of a small group of property-holding white men against the rabble, who, if the rabble got in control, if the rabble were allowed to exercise the democratic right of government, that rabble would not be satisfied with the crumbs that they were getting. That rabble would want a piece of the action. That rabble would want control. And this is what you heard from Dr. Mitchell. He's not really disturbed by the fact that the workplace is a tyranny. He's not really disturbed by the fact that workers don't have any rights. If you get sick and your boss fires you, fine. If you get pregnant and your boss fires you, fine. This isn't a democracy. We exist to serve our shareholders. The fact is that it's the wealthiest Americans who own the vast majority of shares. We're not all shareholders. Some people have retirement accounts, some people don't. The fact is, though, that it's the people who have the least who get crushed under an anti-democratic system. It means that no matter that their boss's whims. In fact, a really interesting example of this is the Me Too situation, where when you have total power in the hands of a boss, and the boss has complete control over your life and what happens to you, it means that if your boss sexually harasses you, you might not have an option. The libertarian answer is always, well, if you don't like it, sucks for you, go someplace else. This is a world of freedom. But we know, people who live in the real world, who've had jobs, who understand that it's not always an option. You can't always go someplace else. People have kids, people got to take care of their kids, people got to live, people got to buy medicine. And we are disturbed, we socialists, by a situation in which people say, well, if you don't like it, go someplace else, because we know that in the reality of people's lives, if you look at the dining hall workers who organized here, you could say, well, if you don't like your working conditions, just go work at another dining hall. The problem is they're all the same. Why? Because power is concentrated in a few hands. If you get to choose between a small number of employers, all of which will treat you like crap, if the choice is working in an Amazon warehouse or working in a Walmart, and either way you're not going to get any say in your workplace conditions, either way they're going to fire you if you do the first thing wrong, because they can replace you pretty easily, then yeah, it is a democracy, and some people are fine with that because they are on the side of the people who benefit from that. But some of us are deeply and truly disturbed by it because we know what it means in the lives of real people. And we know that this fable that is told about how profit only comes because corporations give people what they want is not true. Because if Facebook took a poll, do you want us to manipulate you into buying things that you wouldn't have bought otherwise? Do you want us to give your data to outside third-party firms? You would say no. So they're not giving people what they want. Corporations often trick people. They trick people into signing contracts that they don't understand. Lenders do this all the time. They trick people because people don't understand contracts, and then they say, "Well, look, you signed on the dotted line. Sucks for you." Sucks for you is almost the libertarian philosophy of life. You sign, you have to deal with it. And we don't believe that. In socialists, we think about the lives of people who are mentally ill, people who are disabled, people who are weak and frail, and people who can't compete, people who, the equality, when you say equality of opportunity, we don't guarantee anything to anyone at the bottom except your equal ability to, struggle to the top. Well, there are plenty of people for whom that struggle is impossible. And we think about those people, and we want to make sure that we all come together, and that those people's lives are taken care of by somebody, that they don't just die in the street. To me, the most representative phenomenon in the American capitalist economy is GoFundMes for insulin, for medication. There was a report recently of a guy who couldn't get his GoFundMe funded for his insulin, and he died. And under free market capitalism, in the libertarian world, there's not really much of a problem with that. Certainly the government shouldn't step in. Certainly they shouldn't have paid for his insulin for him like they would have in the United Kingdom. But that to me is a serious problem. To me, that's a dysfunctional economy. To me, at the bare minimum, you have to make sure that things like that aren't happening, that people aren't having to compete to just supply the basics for themselves, that people aren't tyrannized over by their bosses.
I can't help but have two small responses to that. Our motto is "Don't tread on me," not "Sucks for you," but that's a good line. I appreciate that. But here's my serious response. No system anywhere in the world has come remotely close to generating the wealth and prosperity that free enterprise has generated. Nothing close. So we can live in a world where we wish that scarcity didn't exist. We can live in a world where we wish somehow there were money trees and we just pick whatever we wanted. But if over time you want to make sure those people at the bottom, the less fortunate, if you want to make sure that there's a society that generates the prosperity that's necessary to give people better lives over time, there is no substitute for free markets. There's no substitute for limited government. No socialist society in the history of the world has ever generated prosperity. Now, there are societies that generated prosperity and then adopted welfare states once they became rich. That's a good description of Sweden and Denmark. Sweden and Denmark now grow a little bit slower because they adopted welfare states, but at least they still rely on markets to allocate resources. So you can make trade-offs. All I'm saying is we have to recognize that the trade-offs exist. And I'm a big believer that in the long run, economic growth is a wonderful thing. It's not everything. If you don't have meaningful lives with family and community and stuff like that, life would be pretty sterile. So I'm not saying everyone should go out there as some sort of Randian entrepreneur and do nothing but make money their whole lives. But I am saying that markets generate the wealth and the prosperity that makes the rest of life much more possible to be lived in a happy and free and fulfilling fashion.
The next time I meet my friend with no teeth, I'm going to explain to him how grateful he should be for the free enterprise system that has enabled him to live in such wonderful prosperity. But what I'd say is, look, you have the ambition right there. Once a country gets rich, as the United States is, it can introduce a social welfare state pretty successfully. As I say, if you ask the Europeans, ask them if they trade their social welfare systems for the American system. They won't give it up because they recognize that first, there is a moral obligation to take care of people who cannot take care of themselves. It is an obligation, it has to be imposed. And as we see that there are plenty of economically free countries that use markets for the most part, but that make sure that we don't have the kind of moral atrocities that we have in the United States, where people die from lack of access to the very, very basics.
I do want to move to our last question before we move to questions from the audience. In 2016, a Harvard University survey found that among young adults between ages 18 and 29, 51% of respondents said they do not support capitalism, and 42% said they support it. So many millennials, especially on college campuses like this, are critical of capitalism and support socialism. Why do you think that is the case? And what do you think is the future of capitalism and democratic socialism in American society? How do you think it will be reflected in the coming midterm elections, which are so close?
I guess I'll take the first shot at that. Well, I'm tempted to be a grouchy old man and say, you young punks just don't understand anything. But I think this gets back to where we started this whole conversation. What is socialism? What is capitalism? I've talked to plenty of, not just young people, old people, middle-aged people, who think, oh, capitalism, that's like, TARP and whatnot, and I say, no, that's the opposite of capitalism. That's cronyism, that's state allocation of resources. And I talk to lots of people of all ages, oh, socialism, that's like Denmark, that's wonderful. And I say, well, there's no government ownership of the means of production there. They're ranked in the top 20 for economic liberty in the world. What if socialism means France? What if socialism means Greece? What if socialism means Venezuela? So the definitions are so imprecise. One thing I've noticed, and I actually try to train myself to use my words carefully, people respond much more favorably to the term free enterprise than they do capitalism. So as someone who's an exponent of limited government and competitive markets, I try to, don't say capitalism, say free enterprise, because people respond better. So a lot of this boils down to terminology. But of course, as a wonky economist, I don't really care about the terminology. All I care about is what I said before. Some systems generate more growth and more prosperity than others. And it's a continuum. Even Hong Kong is far from a pure free market system, and even Venezuela still allows a little bit of free enterprise in its system. And so, so you start with Hong Kong and Venezuela, and then you come to the U.S. and Denmark, and then France, and then Greece, and then Mexico, and then China, and then Russia, and then Angola or whatever. So it's a spectrum out there. Is the world going to end if government gets a little bit bigger? No. But will our economy be a little bit less dynamic? Will we grow a little bit slower? And over time, this, as I said before with my example about U.S. living standards versus Mexican living standards, if we have 1% less growth, even over a couple of decades, that matters. If we grew just 0.2% faster by the end of just 25 years, so within the working lives of all of you in this room, 0.2% growth would mean after 25 years, $4,000 to $5,000 of additional income for the average person. That's the power of compounding, that's the power of faster economic growth. I think that additional economic output is going to make our lives better. I think it's going to make the lives of poor people better. You don't make poor people better in a society where, as I said before, you're reslicing a shrinking pie. That's what you're facing now in some of the European welfare states that are getting hit with this demographic issue, which we haven't even talked about. That's probably the underappreciated issue in the Western world. We're having fewer children, we're living longer, and so social welfare programs that were created on the assumption that there would always be 3 or 4 workers for every old person, now we're moving towards societies where it's going to be 1 to 2 young workers for every retired person. So we're heading basically toward a Greek future if we don't begin to reform these programs. So rather than making government bigger, which I admit doesn't mean the end of the world, but it means less growth, but in my mind that's really, really damaging considering this massive demographic challenge that all of us are going to be facing. Now, I'm going to be in retirement, and all of you are going to be paying exorbitant payroll taxes to keep me, roaming around the nursing home or something like that. I don't really think that's fair. It's going to slow down our rate of economic growth. It's going to reduce your economic opportunity for your futures. So yes, it's all about, do we want to move a little bit this direction or that direction? And my argument is simply that free enterprise is going to give us more of that prosperity over time. And again, I urge you to look at the world as an economic laboratory. Try to find anywhere an example of an economy that became rich with big government. It just doesn't exist.
So I don't think that young people are gravitating towards socialism because they are in any way foolish or misunderstand the term. I think from the people I've talked to, and I've talked on a number of campuses, I find that they actually have something pretty clear in mind. And what they have in mind is a rejection of the idea that you can simply say, economic growth will make us all better off, and that's it. We don't have to think about anything else beyond that. They think that they're not fools. The young people today, they take a look around them. That's why they're socialists. They look around them, and they don't like particularly capitalistic aspects of the world they see. They see 42 people owning more wealth than 3 billion people in the world. They see the richest 3 people in the United States controlling as much as the bottom 50%. And they're horrified because they know what it's like to be in that bottom segment of society. And they don't buy this idea that we just need to focus on growth, 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 growth. Because they also understand that not only is it the case that it won't be the end of the world if you expand Medicare to cover everybody, or if you give people the ability to go to college without a massive amount of debt, or if you guarantee that people get to have teeth. Not only is that not the end of the world, but that the opposite, the maintenance of a laissez-faire capitalist system may well be the end of the world. And the reason is because as we grow, we are on a finite planet with finite resources. And the young people today, they look at the science. They know for a fact that if we continue on the course that we're on, not only will all of that prosperity be in vain, but there's not going to be a world at all. They read the reports. They know that not a single credible international scientific body disputes the mainstream findings on climate change. And what that means is, when the latest IPCC report came out, it said, and the scientists have said that unless we turn on a dime, unless we adopt a very different kind of economy, unless we massively expand the role of government by introducing far higher carbon taxes than we ever thought we would need to, we are facing an existential crisis. And young people today look at the numbers, they look at the facts, they read, they study, and they know that if we stay on the course we're on, we're going to plunge ourselves into the abyss. And they also look at their friends, they look at their families, they look at their communities. They see people suffering. They see that this prosperity, this wonderful prosperity that we all benefit from, it's magnificent, but they don't buy the idea that you can't maintain a perfectly sufficient level of prosperity and also provide for basic needs. They look at McMansions and they see Elon Musk firing a sports car into space, and they see Bezos building his 10,000-year clock in the desert, and they realize that there has to be a better way of allocating resources so that people don't suffer. They see a life of debt stretching out in front of them. And they realize that this is not the future that they want for themselves. And so that's why I think, the question of, what do I think is going to happen in the midterms, I don't know. But I don't think young people are going to change course on the direction of coming around towards something that they call socialism. You're talking, well, has any socialist state ever created prosperity? I don't think there have been socialist states, because I think the states that have called themselves socialists have been authoritarian, and fundamentally the people who define themselves as socialists, they are anti-authoritarians. We don't believe in empowering the state to crack down on dissidents and free speech. We believe that you can combine a civil libertarianism that has a robust public sphere of discussion with a social welfare state, with provision for people who can't take care of themselves. And we don't see those two things as being opposed.
It reminds me, I didn't answer the question about the midterm elections. I'm not a follower of politics. I usually just go look at the political betting markets. But having said that, the political betting markets obviously got 2016 wrong. As a matter of fact, I got 2016 wrong. I actually gave a speech in London on election night. And I told this audience of Brits that you don't need to pay attention to the presidential race. Trump will definitely lose. And I said the House will definitely stay Republican. The only thing you need to pay attention to is the Senate. And thank goodness by the time it got to 5 o'clock in the morning, they were all gone and I didn't look quite so foolish. But having said that, the political betting markets say the Senate will stay Republican, the House will go Democrat. Interestingly enough, I think that the Democrats are in danger of not being able to beat Trump in 2020. And by the way, I'm in the never Trump camp, just to give you my perspective on it. But I think the Democrats, by going so hard left, run the risk of letting Trump win again in 2020, which, depending on which day I wake up on which side of the bed, sometimes I think it would be good, sometimes I think it would be bad. But be careful how far left, for those of you who are Democrats in the audience, be careful of how far left you go, because you may actually let Trump spend another 4 years in Washington.
Let me add something on that. I had I don't know how to say this without sounding obnoxious. I had a slightly better record in 2016. I wrote a piece in February of 2016 called "Unless the Democrats Nominate Sanders, a Trump Nomination Means a Trump Presidency." And at that time, very few people were saying that this guy's going to be president. And I very strongly thought that the Democratic Party, if it didn't speak to people's, to concern of people in my generation about their economic futures, and I didn't think Hillary Clinton was doing that, they wouldn't turn up to vote. And I think that absolutely turned out to be the case. What happened was they didn't feel like there was a reason for them to vote. Young people overwhelmingly in the primary voted for Bernie Sanders. And they didn't come out. I talked to friend after friend who had voted for Bernie in the primary, was disgusted by the way that the Democratic Party sort of had contempt for their interests, sort of wasn't speaking to them. And Sanders offered something that spoke to them. And Trump knew this. He knew that a populist economic platform, which, I mean, he didn't actually carry out in government, he just gave a massive tax cut to the rich and filled the government with swamp creatures. But he knew that by talking about the economy and talking about people's real financial struggles, he could appeal to a segment of the electorate, and also that he would show the Democrats as completely out of touch with the concerns that if you ask people who are our age, they say over and over that they're worried about. And this is the thing, if the Democrats, so I don't think there's any risk that the Democrats go too far to the left. I actually think it's the only way that they can recapture the enthusiasm of the party base is by offering them something. Not just talking about, I can't even remember what Hillary Clinton's policy proposals were. I don't think anyone really can. She lifted a few of them from Bernie Sanders. But when he talks about making sure that people go to college without getting into mountains of debt, when he talks about expanding Medicare so that it covers everyone, people respond to that. You can tell that from the polls. So I think, move to the left. I don't think they need to move to the left, but I do think they need to move to offering the kinds of policies that people say they want. And unless they do that, I do think Trump will get reelected in 2020.
Okay, thanks to both of our speakers. We will now open to questions from the audience. Anam, our PSC member, will go around if you raise your hand.
Thank you both for this discussion tonight. I want to go back to something that you brought up twice, Nathan. The IPCC report, which came out a couple of weeks ago and just has absolutely devastating implications for what happens if worldwide temperatures increase by 2 degrees Celsius or more in the next century, which is a very likely scenario at this point. And so the implications that the report predicted are hundreds of millions of climate refugees, people who have to leave the places they live because they're essentially uninhabitable. Cities becoming just deathly hot, air pollution killing. I mean, it already kills quite a few people every year, but considerably more. So with all those implications, I'd like to ask you both to address how does socialism answer those problems, and how does capitalism answer those problems? And since you didn't mention climate change, Dr. Mitchell, if you don't believe that that's an issue or something we really need to be concerned about, just explain why you think that is.
I didn't mention it because I don't work on that issue. I don't know enough to have an intelligent comment on it. I do have some degree of faith that that there is enough knowledge out there that there will be policies to mitigate. Now, whether that's carbon taxes, which is sort of the favorite of the free market crowd for dealing with it, certainly compared to the command and control regulation approach, I don't know. I don't work on it, and I like to at least try not to spout off on things that I don't follow closely enough. I will tell you, though, having been in plenty of meetings in Washington where economic issues are discussed, and when that issue comes up, I can tell you the challenge that your side faces. There's a sense among a lot of people, presumably mostly Republicans, but I also think among some of the more establishment Democrats, that there's a Chicken Little thing going on, that the Al Gores of the world keep saying, oh, the ice caps were supposed to have melted 5 years ago and things like that. Now, I have no idea whether those predictions were actually real ones or that's just now urban legend, but there's a widespread sense among a lot of people in Washington that they've been told the world's ending for so many times that they now just sort of tune out a lot of this stuff. Now, whether that's a completely closed-minded approach, whether that's based on some reality, I'm just sharing something that I have heard on several occasions that it's just dismissed as a Chicken Little type thing.
Well, I think you heard it right there, is that Republican politics, right-wing politics, and even the more neoliberal or free market democratic politicians in Washington really do dismiss the consensus verdict of the international scientific community. And if it were up to them, this is what you hear a lot, but it's not my issue. I don't know, who knows? And then they do nothing, right? And the fact is that that's just not acceptable anymore. The report makes it clear. And it's written by the people who know the most about this. And I don't think any of us can afford, we can say, well, I'm not an expert, who knows? I don't think any of us can afford to talk that way anymore. I think it's our duty to educate ourselves, to come up with solutions. Now, I'm a pragmatic socialist. I don't have an ideological commitment to a particular means of taking care of a serious problem. I think it does show, I think it's clearly a crisis of capitalism, it's a crisis of unregulated capitalism, because this is the one thing that capitalism is incapable of dealing with completely is externalities. What happens when party A and party B enter into a free transaction, but only over time, millions of those transactions cause an externality. They cause something like the unchecked warming of the planet. And so we have to get over this idea that if we just release the engines of economic growth, we'll all be fine. In fact, the scientific community has made it clear that that is exactly the opposite of what is going to happen. The more we do that, we will doom ourselves. As I say, you read the report, it doesn't play around. This is not Chicken Little stuff. This is stuff by people who know what they're talking about. And it has to be taken very seriously. I'm not going to sit down and propose a climate plan to you. I will defer to people, as I say, who are experts on it, but I will trust the judgment of those who work on and know the most about this issue. I actually think this is a weak point for the left at the moment. I think they proposed, Medicare for all, free college, but I think we need another plank, a climate plank, that is the equivalent of those things, a big comprehensive climate policy. I think we need to take the carbon tax recommendations seriously. As I say, I'm pragmatic. I'm open to having a discussion about that between people who know what they're talking about. But I don't have faith. I don't operate on faith. I think this I don't wave my hands and go, well, I'm sure a solution will be forthcoming. It won't be. It's very, very clear. Everyone who knows about this issue, everyone who studies this issue says it's not happening. It's not going to take care of itself magically unless we act collectively. And we have to use the state. Even Dr. Mitchell mentioned, even the free market solution now is massive state intervention through increased taxation. So it's pretty clear that this issue can't be left alone, that laissez-faire doesn't work, and this proves it.
Listen to that, it did remind me of something, because there is this intersection of climate and taxation. Here's a challenge that also would exist for you folks that are more on the left on this issue. If you really believe climate change is a major problem, you should be in favor of a carbon tax as a substitute for other forms of taxation. And this is where I've actually intersected with some of these people. They always want a carbon tax on top of other taxes. And that, to me, shows that maybe they're more interested in just getting more money for government and making government bigger. So I would suggest that you talk to some of your friends and say, look, if you're really serious about this, you can get all these sort of, it's actually called the Pagoo Club, Pagovian taxes, where you deal with externality. You're probably familiar with it, I assume. This Pagoo Club of free market people who are open to a carbon tax, they're not open to a carbon tax as a net addition to the resources that are controlled by government. And yet, when they try to talk to folks on the left, they say, no, we're not going to strike that deal. We'll only do a carbon tax if it's a net addition to revenues flowing to government. So that does make me a little suspicious that maybe not the true environmental types, but at least the political types in Washington are more, there's I think a fair skepticism of what their motives are, because they seem to simply want to use this as a way of generating revenue, not as a way of dealing with climate. And one final comment. Some of the most horrific environmental abuses have not occurred in free market societies. They occurred in the Soviet Union and China and places like that.
Yeah, so I think it would be immoral to reject, if the only deal on the table was carbon tax as a substitute for other taxes. I think you absolutely have to accept it. There is good reason to use the revenue raised from carbon taxation to pay for other forms of climate mitigation. Certainly, you need to go beyond the mere imposition of additional taxes. I mean, the point about the Soviet Union is just irrelevant because, as I made clear at the very beginning, the Soviet Union has absolutely no relation whatsoever to anything that young people today might